Hello, welcome to another reading from the Scargatherer books, chapter 3 of the Falconer's Quarry today. I'm back in the kitchen on account of the fact that my children are outside on the trampoline with instructions not to stop bouncing till about 20 past 5, and my husband's away, my other half's away, so he isn't going to come tramping through the kitchen noisily asking questions. I thought it's a bit warmer here. I realised on this video I maybe look like I've got some strange growth behind me. It's actually a plant. It's an IKEA bonsai, which my husband recently attacked with some wires and some scissors to try and make it grow more. And amazingly, it seems to be working. I've had that tree for 3 years, I think. Honestly, it hasn't grown at all. Hang on a minute. Just trying to make sure that I'm not jogging it, but equally that I'm comfortable. Yeah, it had hardly grown at all, and that it had the same number of leaves. It lost some and grew some. I had the same number of leaves after 3 years, and then he brutalised it, and now it seems to be doing better. Fortunately, that's not generally his approach to gardening, which is just as well, but it is apparently what you're supposed to do to bonsais. Anyway, so yeah, I'm down here because it's warmer down here than upstairs in the little attic room. I'm always cold. I always have to have a blanket, and it makes me feel like a bit of a granny. So, chapter 3. Where are we? Ah, yes. Okay, so they have come down the hillside. Lucy and Joe on horseback. They've come down from the woods, and there's this amazing huge white hexagonal castle with pennants fluttering. Those are those sideways flags. And brightly coloured shutters, and just the most magnificent sight. If you're curious to look it up, it's also, Old Wardour Castle is actually where they set the very opening scenes of Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, the one with Kevin Costner, which is years and years old. Your parents will probably have seen it when they were teenagers. Were we teenagers? Or early 20s, something like that. Probably teenagers, actually. I was a teenager when that came out, but it is quite good. It starts with a rather brutal bit. I showed it to my children because we wanted to look at Old Wardour Castle being used on film, and then I was a bit shocked by actually how nasty it was. Because it's not quite, I think it's not quite the opening scenes. I think it starts in what's supposed to be a jail in Jerusalem or somewhere on the Crusades. It's pretty brutal. But anyway, that's the setting. It is an amazing place. So they've ridden down. Lucy says to Joe, you take your letter to deliver, and I'll just go and find Tobias. And Joe thinks, oh my goodness, Tobias already, oh no, and realises that Lucy is not going to know what kind of danger Tobias potentially poses to her. Okay. And so, yes, he says, I need to come with you. And she says, I really don't think you need to. You don't need to. And he says, I do. All right, then. If that's what you want, she shrugged. We'll go together. Okay, chapter 3. Lucy rode ahead of Joe out of the woods and down towards the gatehouse. In front of them, a high stone wall stretched away from the track in both directions, encircling the grounds immediately around the castle. Beside the walls on each side were clusters of low buildings. Joe saw a woman come out of one of them and take a vast cloth bundle from a man with a hand cart. That must be the laundry, he guessed. Men came and went through the doors to the other buildings. Smoke rose from some of the chimneys, and he thought he could smell fresh bread. Is one of those a bakery? He called to Lucy. That's the bakehouse there. She pointed to a building on the right. The dairy's at the other end, and the ones in between are the boiling house and the brew house. They're not brewing today, though, because it's still Lent. They'll start again on Monday. Joe remembered the beer they'd drunk in Jorvik, because it wasn't safe to drink the water here. Does everyone drink beer here? He asked. Not all the time. We mostly drink water. Is that all right, then? She nodded. We don't have a spring here, but the well has sweet water. Sweet? Fresh, not brackish. She frowned at him. Of course, Joe said quickly. Anyway, she went on, pointing to the buildings to the left of the track, there's the stable block over there, and beyond it is the forge and the saddlery. The wheelwright's round there too, and the chandler. The what? The chandler. He makes our candles. Don't you have one at Nunny? Oh, yes, certainly we do, Joe said. I just didn't quite hear you. Don't we need to drop the horses off at the stables? No, we'll ride on up to the castle. The stable boy will take them back for us. Great. After Jorvik, it was going to be quite a change, Joe thought, staying in a place where Lucy's family were waited on again. He guessed it would be more like Fishbourne. They'd had an army of slaves there, and he and Lucy had had more than one pointless argument about slavery. At least if these people were servants, they would be earning something, even if it wasn't very much, and he and Lucy could avoid falling out over it again. In the wall, directly in front of them, was the gatehouse. It was like a tiny version of the castle, with ornamental battlements crowning the towers either side of the gateway. The oak doors were open, but as they approached, a man stepped out. He was dressed similarly to Joe, only in blue rather than crimson. Mademoiselle, he greeted Lucy, sweeping his cap off his head and bowing. Did you enjoy your ride? Yes, thank you, Peaks. She gave a regal wave of her hand. Joe smiled. Lucy could be quite the little princess sometimes. He remembered the way she'd spoken to Arethusa. Master Tobias isn't with you? Asked Peaks. No, but the Lord St. John's page accompanied me back through the forest. He is carrying a message for my father. Has Tobias not returned, then? Not as far as I know. Lucy frowned. Never mind, I'll speak to him later. Very good, mademoiselle. Peaks stepped aside, and they rode on through the gate. Why did he call you that? Joe asked. What? Mademoiselle. He didn't sound very French to me. Lucy laughed. He's not, but he likes to make himself sound important. Joe chuckled. He's not the only one. What do you mean? She was indignant. I didn't say anything unusual. It wasn't so much what you said, it was the way you said it. Anyway, Joe went on quickly, why didn't you tell him that Tobias left you to get ambushed? Because he didn't. He couldn't have known that would happen. Joe raised an eyebrow. You don't know him, Lucy said hotly. You've never even met him. I didn't mention it because I didn't want to get him into trouble. Joe pressed his lips together and said nothing. They had arrived at the castle itself. In the entrance, the great door stood wide open. It was hardly secure, Joe thought. But if the family ever felt under threat, he supposed they could drop the portcullis. He squinted up at the walls of the building. There didn't seem to be any arrow slits, so perhaps it wasn't supposed to be a fortress anyway. Quite a lot of people were hurrying to and fro across the grass of the castle compound. They were all men or boys, much more plainly dressed than Joe. In blue, or yellowish, or brown, all wearing caps. Many of them were engaged in jobs he couldn't identify. Nearby, however, he spotted some masons doing repairs to the stonework, and someone perched on a wooden ladder, cleaning the tiny panes of the windows. Further away, 2 men pushed wooden wheelbarrows across the compound. A horse and cart was waiting in the castle gateway. Lucy jumped down from her horse and handed the reins to a boy standing beside the entrance. Come on, then, she said to Joe. For a moment, Joe hesitated. Then he climbed down from his own horse rather more carefully. You need your letter, Lucy reminded him. Joe took it out of the saddlebag. Who do I give it to? Morley, the steward. When he's finished with this delivery, he'll pass it on. Joe examined the script on the front of the letter again. Did you say it was for your father? His name is Lucas. The writing he'd found indecipherable before seemed clearer now, but perhaps that was because he knew what he was expecting. Her father had been Lucullus, and then Lockie. He'd been bound to be Luke or Lucas this time. "That's our surname," she said. "You see those letters there, W.M.? He's William Lucas." Joe nodded, glad that he hadn't tried to impress her by guessing. He wondered about her mother. She'd been Helena and then Aileen. It seemed likely that she would be Helen or Eileen in this world, but he wasn't going to risk getting it wrong. While he stood beside Lucy in the entrance, waiting for the horse and cart to move on, he glanced up at the spikes of the portcullis above them. He hoped the chains were strong. It was all too easy to imagine it crashing down. He peered past the cart along the passageway. The walls were white, just as they were on the outside of the castle, but it was still rather gloomy. 2 torches flickered valiantly in the draught that blew along the corridor to a courtyard beyond. At the corners, the stone fans which held up the ceiling had been painted with green tendrils and leaves and flowers of many different colours. The ceiling itself was a dusky blue. It was beautiful, Joe thought, though it seemed a bit elaborate for a hallway. On the other hand, if this was the way that everyone entered the castle, it would surely impress any visitor. The steward was sitting at a table in a small room on the right, just behind the portcullis. Despite the window and whitewashed walls, it was dim in here too. A candle cast a pool of light over the list the steward was checking. Joe watched him dip his feather quill into an inkwell every few moments as he marked items off. Beside him stood another man, waiting. "That isn't everything we ordered," Morley said. "Will the rest come today, or do we have to wait till Monday?" The other man twisted his cap in both hands. "Today," he assured the steward. "It'll be here by 4. "It had better be," the steward said curtly. "You said that last time." He handed the list back. "Go on through. Fielden will take delivery in the cold storeroom, and I've told him to double-check the quantities of everything this time." The man bowed his head and led his horse and cart along the passageway, beneath a second portcullis, and into the courtyard. Joe shifted uneasily. The steward was clearly not a man to trifle with. Lucy stepped forward now into the office. "Good morning, Morley," she said, curtsying. At once the steward's face softened. "Good morning, Mistress Lucy," he said, taking off his cap and then replacing it. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "This is Master Joseph Hopkins, page to the Lord St. John." She beckoned Joe forward. "He has a letter for my father." Morley nodded to Joe, who lifted his hat and then presented the letter to him. To Joe's surprise, he took out a knife and slid it beneath the seal. He read the letter quickly, then looked up at Joe. "Sir William is still away on business with Sir Thomas," he said. "The letter asks that you wait for his reply. He's expected this evening in time for chapel, but I'll arrange a bed for you. It'll be too late for you to ride back tonight." Joe felt a knot in his stomach loosen. He'd been worried, he realised, about how he would be able to stay here for any length of time. One night wasn't much, but he knew that there was no guessing how things would turn out. Morley put the letter to one side and turned to Lucy again. "You've been out enjoying the fine weather, mistress. I envy you. Spare a thought for me, shut up in here over my papers." He made a sad face. "That's not true," Lucy grinned. "You're not shut up. I see you out around the castle all the time." Morley winked. Perhaps. He turned back towards his desk. Lucy curtsied again, and Joe took the hint and bowed. They were clearly being dismissed. Out in the passageway again, Joe asked, "What happens now?" "Well, you're not in my family's employment, so you don't have any duties until Morley sends for you again. That means you're free to do as you please." "What about you?" "There'll be a mass this evening for Easter Eve, but there's nothing I have to do this afternoon. We'll be having dinner quite soon, though." Joe looked automatically at his watch, which wasn't there. "What time is it now?" She shrugged. "Between 10 and 11, I'd guess. Does it matter? Dinner will be around 11. They'll ring the bell to call us. Won't be much of a meal, though." Not like tomorrow. I can't wait. What's the big occasion? As soon as the words were out, I realised he'd said something stupid. Lucy looked at him with narrowed eyes. I don't understand you. You say you lost your memory when you bumped your head, but how can you not remember that Easter Day comes after Easter Eve? She turned and walked away along the passage towards the courtyard. Joe hurried to keep up with her. Of course, he said, I do know, it's the end of Lent. I'd just forgotten for a second. Well, anyway, Lucy sounded grumpy. I'm fed up with fish, 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 that's all. Tomorrow there will be meat and eggs and cream. Her voice began to sound dreamy. And all sorts of puddings with sugar and spices. It's going to be wonderful. It emerged into the courtyard. It was in the shape of a hexagon, like the outer walls of the castle itself. Small pointed windows, like Joe had seen in churches, were set into walls that towered 3 or 4 stories high. Only a hexagonal scrap of blue sky was visible overhead. The sun wouldn't often shine down into here, Joe thought. In fact, they might as well have put a roof on it to keep out the rain, but then, of course, it would be completely dark. To both sides of where Joe stood with Lucy, there were doorways into what seemed to be storage rooms. The horse and cart were pulled up beside one of these, and 2 men passed down barrels and packets from the back of the cart to boys who scurried in and out. On the opposite side of the courtyard, a rug had been hung on a frame. A youth was hitting it with bundles of twigs, creating clouds of dust, to the evident annoyance of a man standing on a ladder repainting the stonework. At the foot of the ladder, a pair of much younger boys knelt on the cobbles. They were obviously supposed to be polishing some plates and goblets, but they were poking and pinching each other when they thought no one was looking. In the middle of the courtyard there was a well with a brightly coloured wooden roof over it. A boy ran out of a doorway carrying an empty leather bucket, lowered it hastily into the well, dragged it back up again, and staggered off, slopping water over his feet at every step. "Aren't there any women here?" Joe asked Lucy. She looked at him curiously again. "Surely it's the same at Nunney, isn't it? There are women in the laundry and dairy, and as maids to the ladies of the family, but everything else is men's work." "I suppose so," Joe said, not very convincingly. It was clear that the excuse of losing his memory was wearing thin. The trouble was there were too many things he wanted to ask about. "Shall we go and see my mother?" Lucy gestured to the other side of the courtyard. "I'd like to introduce you to her, though we won't stay long. She's attending my sister. Anne's really ill." For a moment Lucy's eyes clouded. Then she thrust out her chin and said, "She's going to get better, though." Joe studied his friend's face. He could see that she didn't believe her own words. "What's wrong with her?" he asked. "Too much excitement," they said. "Or perhaps God is testing her. Anyway, her humours are out of balance." Joe was about to ask what that was supposed to mean, but stopped himself. The Lord St. John's page would know. They went across the courtyard, past what Joe assumed were kitchens from the clattering and shouting. The heat from the fires wafted out into the fresh air, carrying with it a smell of fish. Joe followed Lucy through a small archway and up a spiral staircase. On the first floor there was a door, but Lucy continued past it to another door on the second floor. The stairs went on up. There must be a huge number of rooms in the castle, Joe thought. Presumably Lucy's uncle had a large family. "This is where I sleep," Lucy said, stepping into a square room. In the far corner was a 4-poster bed, with the heavy curtains drawn back. "Anne usually shares with me, but my mother has moved her into their chamber. Cecily sleeps here too when she's at home." Joe looked around. It was in no way like his own bedroom. The walls were white, with no pictures except for a rather formal hunting scene, which had been painted directly onto one wall. A wooden chair was drawn up beside a fireplace, and a chest stood beneath the small window that overlooked the courtyard. Opposite, in the left-hand wall, there was a larger window looking out over the grounds behind the castle. There was nothing else in the room except some cushions piled in the corner on the bare floorboards. "Where do you keep your things?" he asked. "Things? You know, toys and things that matter to you." He tried to think of an example. Books must still be rare in Lucy's time, so she wouldn't have any of those. He thought of the boxes of Lego, action figures and bits of this and that which his mum periodically made him clear out. Most of it was plastic, of course, which didn't exist in Lucy's world. Nor did pens and pencils. And Lucy wouldn't be allowed to draw on paper or make stuff out of card because that would be much too expensive to be wasted on play. "I don't know," he said. "Smooth pieces of wood or shells or feathers, things you want to keep." She pulled a face. "That's so like a boy. Peter collects stuff like that." She went over to the wall beside the bed and opened a little door set in the stonework at about waist height. Carved out behind was a rectangular space fitted with shelves. An early built-in cupboard, Joe thought with a grin. He'd assumed that they were an invention of the 1990s. "My embroidery stuff is there," she pointed, "and my comb. And there's a note from Peter that he managed to get delivered by someone travelling this way." She shut the door and turned round, about to cross the room when she caught sight of something through the outer window. Joe looked over her shoulder. A boy a few years older than him was walking across the grass below, carrying a wooden pail. He was tall and broad, with curly dark hair. He was dressed in several shades of brown, and he wore long leather boots. From his wrists to near his elbows were some kind of leather cuffs. "Look," Lucy said, "there's Tobias." Joe swallowed. He'd known who it was before she'd spoken, but he'd been hoping he was wrong. After all, Tobias had been fair-haired last time. "We'll come back and visit my mother later," she said. "Let's go and catch Tobias now, while we can." Okay, so that's the end of chapter 3. We don't know yet, or do we know? Do we know what Tobias does? She probably mentioned it. When she said why she was out with him. That would have been in chapter 2, I expect. I'm just looking for it. Whether we know who Tobias is. Can't see it. Not sure. Anyway, we'll soon find out. Whether we knew already or not, we will soon find out exactly who Tobias is and whether he is the same as always. What do you think? I leave it to you to decide. Right, that's it for today. I will see you again for another video tomorrow.